Okay, so let's get started talking about everyone's favorite topic, airspace. If you get a second to enter into the poll there what you find most confusing about airspace, we will try and focus a bit more time on those things as we go. And I mentioned it just before we got started, but in this post you'll see that I've posted some links under a resources header. If you have another tablet or screen or tabs that you can open all of those up in, we will be referencing them at various points throughout this. So if you want to get them loaded up in advance, then I'll walk you through how to find different resources. And most of it is for free, so that's good. Okay, let's first start with going through Airspace Classes. So this is A through G, the classes of airspace, because this is something that it's a good starting point to understand what's required, what's necessary, and how these things apply to drone pilots, because most of the resources that are out there, when they're addressing airspace, it's not really from the pilot, like the drone pilot perspective. It's more about like the manned aircraft resources that are out there and then just trying to interpret what they are. So let's go from the beginning until Class G. So Class A and Class B, you really don't have to worry about as a drone pilot. So they exist. It's good to know. They are very high levels of airspace. They're bands of airspace that get progressively higher. Class B starts at 12,500 feet. Class A starts at 18,000 feet, 8,000 feet. So if your drone is up at that altitude, you have other problems, and it's not something that you really need to worry about on a day-to-day basis as a drone pilot. So don't concern yourself too much with Class A and Class B airspace. Where we get into some fun is Class C, Class D, and Class E. And those three classes of airspace, from the drone pilot perspective, you kind of treat them the same way when they touch the ground. So both, or all three, Class C, Class D, and Class E, are all types of controlled airspace. And when they touch the ground, they're around an airport or an aerodrome. And those are the ones where you need to get permission before you operate within them. So from an operational perspective, there are different things that they mean, but operationally, as a drone pilot, you can kind of treat them all the same. Class C, Class D, and Class E, you can treat them the same way. So it is controlled airspace, and therefore you need to get permission. And that's one of the things that's showing up as one of the priorities for things you find the most confusing. And I've got a good answer for you, because it's actually pretty straightforward to get permission for Class C, Class D, or Class E, and that is to fill out the NAV Canada Flight Authorization request. And if you Google just that, it will show up. So you'll be able to take a look. If you just Google it right now, I should have put it into these things. I'll see if I can add it in later. NAV Canada Flight Authorization request. And then through there's you fill out this gigantic form, and then you can your information. And actually, this is probably good to understand what actually happens. So when you fill out that NAV Canada flight authorization form, what happens is your information gets submitted to the Flight Information Center for your region, and there is a Flight Information Center. Oh geez, I'm not going to be able to try and name them all, but the one where I am is in Kamloops, BC. So in the Pacific region, Pacific Flight Information Region, it's in Kamloops. So you submit that form, and it shows up in an email inbox at the Kamloops FIC, and there's a NAV Canada specialist who works there. And well, there's a few of them. And from 6 a.m. until 10 p.m., that inbox is monitored. So I remember I was in Ottawa with a bunch of drone people and Transport Canada people when NAV Canada announced that this was the process, and it says give them 2 to 14 days to process it, and people lost their minds. But I promise you, it typically does not take that long, because like I said, it's monitored from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m., 7 days a week, 365. There's always somebody that's there monitoring this thing for the most part. So you submit that, shows up in the inbox, and a really key thing when you're submitting that submitting that form is when you are talking about the radius of your flight. And I apologize if you were on the USC webinar last night, because I talked about the same thing there too. But when you're filling that out, you want to keep the radius of your flight as tight to your flight area as possible. Try not to just be like, I'm going to be flying like 1 nautical mile from this longitude and latitude point. Try and keep it as close in as you can, because NAV Canada at the FIC will take that information, and if it's something that they can approve on their own, they will straight away. But if it's something that might be higher risk, or it's bringing you really close to an airport or touching an area that an airport wants to have final say over, then then it has to go to the tower. That duty manager has to be in. They're the ones that have to approve it. And then it comes back to the Flight Information Center, and then it goes to you. So that's why it can take up to 14 days, which it won't, but it sometimes could if that duty manager's on vacation or something. So I kind of forget where I started off with. Oh yeah, Class C, Class D, Class E. You just fill out that form if you're going to be flying in that airspace. And we'll talk about how to identify what airspace you're in very soon. Class F is a bit of a fun one. So you can remember that, Class F. An acronym for it is fun, firing, and things you should stay the F out of. So there's three types of Class F airspace. There's CYRs, CYAs, and CYDs. CYDs you probably won't see too much of, but you will see lots of CYRs and CYAs. So a CYR is restricted, and that's different from controlled. So don't get those two things confused. They are synonyms, I guess, but they mean very different things in the airspace system. So controlled means that you get NAV Canada permission prior to operating within it. Restricted means that there's some user group that has responsibility for approving things that happen within that airspace. So we're talking about things like airspace over prisons. We're talking about things like military training areas. So if it's something where there is Class F restricted airspace, you cannot just go and fly there. You need to get permission from whatever that user group is before you show up with your drone and try and fly in that airspace. Even if you were flying like right next door to that airspace, I would still give that user group a heads up just to be a good neighbor, be a good drone pilot, also so they don't like shoot you out of the sky or something. CYAs, you can treat pretty much like Class G airspace. So a CYA is still Class F. It's an A because it's advisory. And that A is advising you of something that's happening in that airspace that you're going to want to know about before you fly there. So CYAs exist for flight training. They exist for parachutes, like parachuting, skydiving. They exist for glider operations, helicopter training, or like helicopter operations, hang gliding. There's all kinds of things, and I'll show you how you identify what those are. And the thing with a lot of those activities is that they bring manned aircraft very close to ground level, like below 400 feet, well below 400 feet, especially if it's skydiving, they got to come down at some point. So if it's a Class F CYA, you don't need prior permission to operate in there. You don't need to get permission from NAV Canada, but you do need to be very, very cautious because there could be lots of low-level aircraft. And obviously, being a drone pilot, you're already low level. You don't want to be interfering with any of that. So that's a pretty key thing. Class G airspace is your good to go airspace. It's wide open for the most part, no permissions required. That's where you can operate with a basic certification. And that's kind of a key thing there. Class G is the majority of Canadian airspace. It's anything that isn't A through F, but it is a little bit harder to identify, especially on charts like the aviation charts, like the VTA and VNC, because it doesn't have borders because it's everything that isn't something else. So we'll take a look at how to identify that as well. All right, I see there's some questions that are coming in, so I'm going to scan through them, and if it's something that we'll talk about later, I will address it then. Does DJI mean no more DJI drones going forward? Banning? There's nothing that I know about banning DJI drones. That would be a problem. Oh, thanks, Arden. That's great. All the flight information centers, those were the ones that I wasn't going to try and remember off the top of my head. And Matthew, you're the best. Thanks for dropping that in there. That's the flight authorization request. And yeah, Benjamin, that's a good point. When if you're trying to fly in a CYR and the user group is the one that's asking you to, then it makes it pretty straightforward to get their permission. Excellent. Okay, so those are the classes of airspace A through G. Any questions on that before I keep moving on? There is information in that first link on our blog post that talks about the airspace classes as well, and also has some diagrams. And now I want to talk about taking that and applying it to how you actually figure out what class of airspace a particular location is. Also, actually, just one thing quickly, sub 250 gram drones. So I've had a lot of questions about whether or not they can fly in controlled airspace, and the answer is yes. You can fly a Mavic Mini in controlled airspace. You can fly a Mavic Mini closer than 3 nautical miles to a airport or 1 nautical mile to a heliport. However, there is one regulation that you are required to abide by regardless of the weight of the RPAS that you're flying. So the one rule that applies to everything is that you can't be a hazard. So don't be a hazard to airspace users and don't be a hazard to people on the ground. So with airspace users, they're obviously going to be in controlled airspace, so you still can't be a hazard. I think actually it's harder as a Mavic Mini pilot to make a proper go, no-go decision about the safety or how much of a hazard you're going to be, because it's not prescriptive. It's not stay 3 miles away. It's not stay 30 meters from people. So you have to be very careful. Be prepared to justify why you thought it was safe to fly where you were flying if it doesn't prove to be safe, or if it gets a little bit risky. But there is no rule that says that Mavic Mini pilots cannot fly in airspace. The only rule is don't cause a hazard. So if you choose to interpret that as being, I'm just going to stay out of airspace because I feel like that's hazardous, then great, that works. But that's not what the regulation says. You can fly in controlled airspace, just be very, very cautious. And if you open up the Mavic Mini app, there is the map that's on there, and they've got I can't remember if they're like the runway hot dogs that show the airspace around the runways or just the area around the runways, but they do have the flight pass, like the approach pass and departure paths off of runways. So that's a pretty clear distinction. Try and avoid those areas because that's where the manned aircraft are going to be descending and coming into land. So they might end up being at the same altitude at the same time, which is undesirable. All right, looking through some of these. Listening from far away. Hello, Len. All the way on the other side of the country. No flying in CYD without permission. So CYDs are kind of funky. They technically only, and I think I'm getting this right, double check the AIM if you want. They are, I'm getting lots of emojis right now. CYDs exist over international waters. So I think they're a type of CYR, or they're closely related to a CYR. I think there's a user group associated with them. So if you find yourself in international waters or on the edge of the ADAs or something like that, then you might encounter a CYD. But that's a good question, Kurt. I didn't prep for that one, so you caught me off. Benjamin asks, what about sub 250 grams in national and provincial parks? So the national and provincial parks have a rule that says, and I could get the actual phrasing here for you in a sec, but it says that you can't operate a drone within the park. It doesn't say you can't operate a small RPAS, which is 250 grams to 25 kilograms, it just says drone or remotely piloted aircraft or something. So that includes the sub 250 gram drones. So you cannot be an operator with your drone pilot feet inside of a national or provincial park. However, I did get clarified from Transport Canada that if you are a drone pilot with your feet outside of the park and your drone is flying inside of the park, that is okay. So fly line of sight, or don't be a hazard with your sub 250 gram drone in terms of how far away you fly from it. But yeah, if you're outside the park, your drone can be inside the park. Still, don't cause a hazard. Be a nice person. Don't be the guy that's ruining everybody's picnic because you're flying your drone over top of them. But yeah, that is the official rule. And same thing with like cities. That's been a big thing lately. If you've been in a couple of Facebook groups, you might have seen the interview I did with Global yesterday about cities making up bylaws about drones. They can't restrict the airspace that you're flying in. They can tell you can't fly on city property, but if you launch from private property and fly your drone over city property, that's okay. Yeah, it's tricky with that property permission. It's not written into the CARs that you need to have property permission prior to launch, but it's a very, very good idea. You still have to abide by all of the other laws that apply to Canadians, like privacy, trespassing, all of those things. So just because it's not in the CARs doesn't mean that it's not something that you have to abide by still. Visual line of sight doesn't apply to sub 250. Correct. You can fly sub 250 beyond line of sight, but don't cause a hazard. So there's always that caveat on there. From what I understand, from what I've experienced, the Mavic Mini range is probably the worst thing about it. So keep that in mind. I don't think I'd want to let that thing out of my sight because I don't think the range is going to keep it safe all on its own. Okay, I'm getting a little bit off topic, but okay, let's take a look. Actually, let's talk about layout a little bit. So Airspace exists with these different classes to provide a method to get airplanes and helicopters, fixed wing aircraft, from one part to another safely. And what happens is when you have an airport, let's pretend my mic is the center of the airport, you end up with this radius of airspace around it that extends upwards. So it's this kind of cone of airspace that exists above the airport. And then the next layer is a little bit higher. It doesn't touch the ground. So everything below that is Class G, but then everything above is a little bit, it's kind of like you've taken a wedding cake and you've flipped it upside down on top of an airport and you get these tiers that exist. And then eventually those tiers will turn into Class E airspace airways that connect to different airports. Nowadays, people aren't flying from NAV to NAV to NAV because there's this beautiful thing called GPS. And so you'll oftentimes have these really large swaths of controlled airspace that exist, like they're off the ground, they're up off the ground, they start at 2,200 feet or 2,500 feet or higher, and they just allow there to be someone in contact with all the planes that are flying by GPS or flying visually with reference to the ground. They'll have someone that's in touch with all of them. So this is something that we often, I've talked to a few reviewers, people have commented on these things leading up to the webinar, this concept of overlying airspace or understanding what exists around you. So if you have a tab, and you can, I would love it if you could go to the drone site selection tool right now, and let's all zoom in on the same area. I am going to pick Halifax because I like Halifax, my hometown. Okay, so on the drone site selection tool, I want you to zoom into Nova Scotia. And right under the S in Nova Scotia, you'll see a few red circles. That's where Halifax is. So zoom into there. Okay. So hopefully now you've zoomed in on the drone site selection tool and you can see that there are some red circles, some yellow circles, some yellow hot dog shapes, some weird polygon shapes, kind of all over the place. And so if you haven't used the drone site selection tool before, this is a good opportunity. Let's see if you can find the Stanfield International Airport. So that's just north of the city. You can see like Goffs, Enfield, Elmsdale, Wellington represent. So if you hover your mouse over the airport, it says Stanfield International, and you see that circle, that's indicating you're 3 nautical miles from the center of the aerodrome that you have to stay out of as a basic category pilot. That bigger circle that you're seeing there is showing you the edge of the airspace. So a basic category pilot couldn't fly at 4 nautical miles from this airport because they'd still be in controlled airspace. So you can see when you hover over there, it says Airspace, Halifax, Stanfield International, Nova Scotia. Control zone is Class D from the surface to 3,000 feet above ground level. So you can't be, as a basic category pilot, within either of those red circles, and that's why they're red. So even that's why there's those 2 rules. It's that you can't be 3 nautical miles within 3 nautical miles of an airport, and you can't be in controlled airspace, because sometimes they don't mean the same thing, like here. With anything that's yellow, there is an aerodrome, and there's an aerodrome in Fall River. Len, where's that? Anyway, if you click on that, it says that it's something that you shouldn't necessarily fly in because it's kind of a warning area because there's an aerodrome there. But aerodromes are different than airports, so you can operate in that area. So that's Class D airspace, and you get that just from the fact that when you hover your mouse over it, you can see that it's Class D. If you were to now go to the Canadian Airspace viewer, and you zoom over to where Halifax is, you'll see that it's a bit of a mess of polygons and colors and shapes and all kinds of things. Oh, perfect, float dock. Sorry, I missed the Montreal and St. John's ones before, but we can take a look at them for other examples. Okay, so now we're on the Canadian Airspace viewer, and you'll see there's a big mess of colors and lines and circles and all of that. So let's try and remove some of these filters. So let's look at show only when airspace is, and then select below and select 700 feet. And that cleans things up a whole lot. So in that left-hand menu, you're making some adjustments to the filters. And I should mention that this website isn't a NAV Canada approved resource, but it does a really good job of cleaning up the VTAs and VNCs so that we can see this. And once you can see it on here, I think it'll make it easier to look at it on those VTA and VNCs, the official resources. So now if you hover your mouse over the Halifax airport, you can see that it says surface to 3,000 feet is Class G. You get that same information. And remember, this one's just showing airspace. It's not showing where airports are. So we're missing some of that other information that we had on the site selection tool, because that one's really geared towards our past pilots and showing you where aerodromes and airports are in addition to airspace. Airspace doesn't have to be associated with an airport or an aerodrome. Now I want you to select above 700 feet. And there you see all of this other stuff pop up. So what you're seeing there, and you can deselect a lot of the filters, take away Class B, you can even take away Class C, you can take away D if you want, and even F, and just take a look at that Class E airspace. So all of that exists, and if you hover your mouse over it, over the one that kind of looks like a peanut, it says Halifax, Nova Scotia, TA, Class E, 700 feet to overlying airspace. So this is something that, as a flight reviewer, I'm looking for an advanced category pilot to understand when they're picking a spot to fly. If we had picked a location that was outside, like just outside of Halifax's airspace, it all looks good. But if we have a vertical flyaway, the drone just starts without any control, it just starts drifting upwards, starts climbing, which has happened. I'm not making these things up. Then I want you to know, I want you to be able to tell me that there's airspace above us and that it's controlled airspace. It's Class E. And now I want you to understand, who do I need to contact in this event? So there's a bit more to things than just understanding what's touching the ground, it's also really important to understand what exists above you. And we'll come back to this, getting phone numbers and permissions and that sort of thing in a little bit. I think if we click this one, yeah, it just tells you to reference the Designated Airspace Handbook if you click on that peanut shape. And that's another resource that I provided to you there. And there you can see with all that classy airspace highlighted, there's a bunch of those rectangles. Those are showing air routes. Class E airspace by default starts at 2,200 feet unless otherwise specified. So on here, it's pretty easy to tell what's specified. You just hover your mouse over it and it'll tell you what's going on. But there is, that'll come into play when we look at the VTA and the VNC. All right, let me check and make sure there's no other comments on here that I missed. Okay. So does that kind of make sense with Class E airspace? For something like in the Vancouver area, although where we do our flight reviews here, I guess this is a hint for anyone doing a flight review with Coastal with me at our office, we're in Class G airspace. We're right in between two control zones, but directly above us is more controlled airspace, and it's Class C airspace that exists above us. So something to be aware of, because it's going to be something that's really key to understand, is how things exist above you as well as laterally. So you want to have that full picture of airspace around you. All right, those people that asked me to touch on the vertical airspace structure, did I get it, or is there more that I can go into there? Let me know in the comments. Another resource that I find really valuable, if you don't want to pick up paper charts, although they're kind of fun to have. I've got one on the wall just across here that I would spin my computer around, but that seems unnecessary. Sometimes they're not the most practical thing to use, and they expire and they're tough to keep up to date with. So, or they can be. It's not really that bad, but it is a little bit annoying to have all that paper with you. So if you go to that flightplan.com link, the fltplan.com, on that main page, if you go over to the digital charts tab, it's on the far right of those little icons towards the bottom of the page. So click on digital charts, and this is a US website. So they don't call their VTAs and VNCs, they call them sectionals and TACs. So you'll click on sectionals, that's a VNC. Don't have to fill out any of the other information. And it will load up this, all of the maps stitched together, which is really nice to see. You'll notice, especially if you are in like Southern Ontario, that you're covered with this like darker colored map as to what's covering the rest of Canada. And that's because it's US based, so it's showing you the US charts primary. So on that menu that pops up on the left-hand side, select sectionals-Canada, and that'll switch it up so that all of Canada is covered on the maps. And then you can zoom in, and let's go to somewhere that has a VNC and a VTA. So what you should see now is in some areas, like let's go to like the Montreal area. Like over Montreal and Ottawa, you see these slightly different colored squares. Before you zoom in all the way, they're a little bit lighter. They look a little less cluttered, and those are your VTAs. If you're not seeing that, go back to that menu on the side and make sure that TAC charts is selected. And when you do that, that's when you get your terminal area charts, which are VTAs in Canada. And actually, I know I said go to Montreal, but let's go to Halifax. Let's go back to the area that we were looking at before. And hopefully, some of this will start to make a little bit of sense. I know it looks overwhelming, and I picked a spot that didn't have a VTA, so I could have made that a bit easier. But see if you can zoom in and spot the square bracket shapes that surround the Halifax International Airport. And that is showing you the Class D airspace. And so it says CZD. If you follow the perimeter around, you'll see it says CZD in quotation marks, 3,500 feet, and then 3,000 feet in brackets. So it's saying it's 3,500 feet above sea level. The airport's 500 feet up-ish, 477. So it's 3,000 feet above ground level, which is what we saw in the other charts. So we know they weren't lying, which is nice. So that's your airspace indicator for Class D airspace. And actually Class C is the exact same square bracket shape, but it'll say Control Zone C in brackets instead. If you start to move in any direction out from there, go really slowly. And if you go, let's say like due east, towards like Mount Uniacke, you'll start to see a like lightly shaded purple line that's kind of staggered. There's like kind of overlapping as it goes around. So that is indicating Class E airspace. And so that's our spot that's telling us, like we saw before, that the Class E was at 700 feet. And the reason why it's staggered like that is because if you keep going out a little bit further, you'll see another one, and that one has a solid line. So that's more Class E airspace. And so what that's trying to tell you is you've got Class D touching the ground, got a chunk of Class E that's here at 700 feet, and I'll show you how we know that in a second. Class E at 700, and then there's more Class E that exists above it, starts higher. So you've got D up to here, and then you've got Class E would start at 700 feet, so nice and low next to it, but extending way up. And then out from that, you've got at a higher level, Class E again. But anything below that 2,200 feet all the way out here and 700 feet a little bit closer in is Class G, uncontrolled airspace. Because remember when we looked at the Canadian airspace viewer before and we had the filter set to below 700 feet, we didn't see that stuff. So it was all Class G, all uncontrolled airspace. I hope this is making sense. Within that, I'm trying to see where it is. Within that first radius around with the staggered line, there should be a spot that says E700. And I'll highlight it when I put this onto the YouTube video. But I'm not able to see it. Oh, it's awkwardly hiding way far south. If you go like over the water, over the Atlantic Ocean, you can see a spot where it says E700. It's like down past the CYR, but it's the same color as that border. So we're into like the bottom half of the peanut. You can see where it says E700. So that's telling you that the base of Class E the Class E airspace base is at 700 feet. So what's below it? Class G. And then if you go one further out, there's nothing in that one that has E and then a number. So you would just assume that it starts at 2,200 feet. And I've seen that on the Transport Canada test, is it has a spot with Class E airspace. It's like, what's the floor of this airspace? And you have to know that it starts at 2,200 feet because nothing is listed. So I know this stuff can get frustrating and can get confusing because you're like, why do I need to know these things? Because I fly 400 feet and below. But that's if everything goes right. So you want to make sure that you understand what exists above you so that you know what class of airspace you're in and what to do if things don't go well. Okay. So I'm just looking at my checklist here of things I wanted to talk about. So I've hit Airspace Classes. We talked about the flight authorization request, and Matthew was really nice to put that link in the comments for me. We talked about the layout of airspace. We talked about sub 250 gram drones. A little bit, yes, this is the next thing. Who to contact, when to contact them, how to get that information. If there's other things, that's kind of the last thing on my list to talk about is how to get in touch with NAV Canada through a bunch of different ways. So if there's more that you want me to talk about, if there's something, even if it's not airspace related, that I could still answer some questions on, just drop that in the comments and I'll take a look once I get through this thing. Benjamin asked, is there an open data portal? No, there is not. So NAV Canada is a private company and they're not for profit, but they charge quite a bit. I hope no one from NAV Canada is watching. I really like you guys. But it costs like 15 grand to get a license for this information. So yeah, I don't know where the Canadian Airspace Viewer guy got his data from. It's been reliable when I've used it, but I do recommend like using it in conjunction with something else or to help clarify airspace in an area perhaps, so that when you first look at Halifax you're like, oh, this is too much, but then you can kind of filter through the airspaces and then look at it on the map and it might make a bit more sense. Oh, one thing I should have talked about was how to identify Class F airspace as well, and the difference between Class F CYRs and Class F CYAs. If you still have the flightplan.com tab open and you're looking at the Halifax area, there's a CYR that's right there. So if you look just over the Atlantic Ocean, just kind of southeast of Dartmouth, it says CYR 748 to 1,500 feet, occasionally by NOTAM. And those NOTAMs are controlled by CZQM, which is Moncton Flight Information Center. And Class F, regardless of if it's a CYD, CYA, or CYR, it's always going to have that like solid border with all the little lines pointing in towards the center. It looks a little bit different if it's in a circle. So you can see one just in the Bedford Basin. So in between the yellow areas of Halifax and Dartmouth, there's a little tiny circle. It says CYR 719 maybe. It's hard to see on here. To 1,700 feet continuous. So it's always that way. And again, that's controlled by CZQM. Class F CYAs will look the exact same. Just looking for one right now. If you go over towards the Minas Basin, so on the other side of Nova Scotia, there's a little tiny one right by the heliports over there in the valley. You've got CYR. Oh, sorry, there was a CYA somewhere. Where is that one? Where is that one pointing to? Oh, it's that solid circle. So it says CYA. I guess it was so small that when they put all the lines, it made it solid. CYA 703P in brackets. So there's parachuting happening. So that's an area that you want to avoid flying in because there's meat bombs and you don't want to run into them with your drone because they might get angry about that. Other things that you might see might be for like flight training. And as a flight instructor, I can fly below 400 feet if I feel like it's necessary to deliver the point of the thing that we're practicing. So for example, like a forced approach, if I really want to see if my student is going to make a field, I might just tell them, keep going, keep going, keep going. I'll tell you when to overshoot. Like, let's see if you can actually make this thing happen. Sometimes it does not work out. And so or we do them out from that field, we might get like way below. Okay. So CYR, CYAs, I think I got them there, but if there's more that you want, let me know. And I have to remember what I was going to talk about. Oh, phone numbers. One other really brilliant thing with this flightplan.com, if you don't want to pay, and this is an app as well, if you go in the app store for Flightplan Go, is what it's called as an app, and it's FLT. When I say flight, it's FLT plan. So go back to just straight up fltplan.com. And this time select FBO and airport info. It's the second tab in from the left. And here in that far left-hand airport FBO search, an FBO is a fixed base operator. It's like the businesses that operate on airports that provide services to manned aircraft pilots. So you don't really care so much about those, but it will tell you if an airport has a restaurant, which might be handy in some cases. You can either enter the airport ID or you can search for an airport or a city. I'll type in, let's do my home airport, CYPK. and that will bring up a page for the Pitt Meadows Airport. And if you scroll down about midway down that page, there's a big green button that says CFS, Canada Flight Supplement for CYPK. If you click on that, then you get the Canada Flight Supplement page, and there is a boatload of information. One really key thing, and this was a good example to bring up, is that this one is 2 pages, and sometimes people forget that there could be 2 pages. So always read through the CFS until you see the double line. So if you go right to the bottom, right before Plattsville starts, there's a double line just under the caution section. That's how you know that you've gotten to the end of that CFS page for that airport. Most of the categories on here you won't really care about, but we were talking about contact information. So let's say you have a flyaway and it's heading towards Pitt Meadows Airport because you did a site survey beforehand and you knew generally where the airports were in relation to where you were flying. Your airport's bombing off towards the Pitt Meadows control zone, and you want to get in touch and give them a heads up because that's really important and should be a part of your procedures. Scroll down until in that left-hand column you see the spot where it says COMM, C-O-M-M, and then you see ATIS, ground tower, and MF, which is mandatory frequency, not the other thing that MF can stand for. And so it gives you some information. Those are frequencies. This airport, you can actually get the weather information, the ATIS, on your phone, which is pretty sweet. Vancouver Island and the Lower Mainland have that service. And if you look where it says tower and just follow that line across, it says emerge only, and then it gives you a phone number. That is the phone number for the tower cap. So on the airport, the NAV Canada folks that are employed there will have that phone ringing inside the tower. So this is only to be used in the event of an emergency. If you're looking to plan a flight, there's a different number that you would contact, and now it's all done through the flight authorization request anyway. So this is a number that you would call in an emergency, or if you're bringing them donuts, they like that too. Call that number and they will answer it, and they will say something like NAV Canada Pitt Meadows Airport. And then you might start talking, and then they'll be like, be right back, I gotta go control airplanes. So it depends on how many people are actually there. But you give that phone number a call, you're talking right to an air traffic controller that's working at the airport. So if it was a flyaway, you'd want to identify that right away. I'm a drone pilot, I have permission to operate south of your control zone. I've had my aircraft has flown away, I don't have control over it. It's climbing, heading towards your airspace, has about 15 minutes of flight time remaining. And then they'll ask you any other questions that they need to get from you. And then you would call them back as soon as something changed, like it hit a tree or it came back and landed, or the battery's dead or something like that. So that's really key. Oftentimes I see people on flight reviews confuse that phone number with the operator phone number. And that's the second block. So if you scroll back up to the first page, it says reference and then operator, Pitt Meadows Airport Society, and then it has that phone number. That's like the airport office. So like who you would call to ask about parking or something like that, like parking your car. They're not NAV Canada. They may be able to get you in touch with them, but if it's an emergency, it's definitely not the fastest route, and they're only open whatever their hours are, like 8:30 to 4:30 or something like that. So not a super reliable thing to use in the event of an emergency. So that is really key. And I've been told, if you flip back over to the tab of the drone site selection tool, I have been told, and I don't know if it's the case yet, I'm just going to check real quick, that all of this information will be available when you click on the bubble on the drone site selection tool for that airport. Right now, it just calls out and says, check the CFS. It can also be found at flightplan.com. So that's good. I'm glad they put that on there. But eventually, I think they're going to tie the contact information right into it as well. Around here in Vancouver, because it's Class C that's above us, it's the Vancouver Control Center, Area Control Center, that controls that airspace. So if you have Class C above you, it'll be an Area Control Center that you'll want to call. If it is if you have a flyaway emergency and it's vertical airspace and you're not sure what's above you, or you're not sure what the area control center phone number is, or you think it's Class E, you're not sure who controls it, then the best number to call is the 1-866-WX brief, 992-7433 is what it is. And that takes you to the closest flight information center, wherever you are in Canada. So you call that and it'll say, thank you for calling the Moncton Flight Information Center. To report an aviation emergency, press 1. So there you go. There's your option. 2 is to fast close a flight plan, and 3 is to speak with a flight service specialist. So if you have questions on like NOTAM or weather or just procedural stuff, you can call them, hit 3, treat them like a human, be really nice, ask them how their day is, and then get the information that you want out of them. At some point, can you comment on getting DJI to unlock your drone in a no-fly zone? So there's, with DJI's RPAS, they have taken the initiative to try and prevent people that shouldn't be flying in certain areas from flying in certain areas. And so they've done this with this no-fly zone map, and they have a few different qualifications for the areas that you need to get unlocks for. Some of them, you just need to have a verified account. Some of them you need to provide evidence that you have permission to operate there in advance. So that's something that you'll want to look into well in advance if you know you're going to be flying on an airport property, for example. Even if you're inside a structure on airport property, and I learned this the hard way, you need to get the unlock to do it, to be able to do it. So there's, I forget what the DJI link is, but it should kind of prompt you through if you Google DJI no-fly zone. You fill out the form on there, provide them the data. It used to be like, show them your SFOC, so now it's show them that you have your flight authorization request, show them that you've got a pilot certificate, and then they should unlock it. And then they give you a code. You have to go into the ellipse menu, the ... menu at the top of DJI Go, and sync things through, because they will tie it to your DJI account, and you have to sync things through. So it does take an extra step, and it's not guaranteed to work. So practice it in advance if you can, if you have that opportunity. But you do have to get it to like pull from the cloud so that it knows that that you have that unlock, and then it's for a specific period of time as well. Advanced license. Send in the online request for NAV Canada flying controlled airspace. How likely are they to say yes or no when your request is reasonable? No, like if it makes sense, then you get a yes. They're not like you don't have to like slip a $5 in with it or send an e-transfer or something like that. It's they want to see you use the airspace. You are a valid user of Canadian airspace, so they want that to happen. It's just something that they need to know, because you don't have a transponder and you don't show up on radar. They just need to know where the drones are going to be so that they can make sure that other people aren't in your way, and vice versa. So as long as it's reasonable, as long as it makes sense, then yeah, they'll go for it. Ongoing permission is a bit of a tricky one. They may get you to go through the flight authorization request form over and over and over again. But there is a Chrome extension that you can add in that saves everything in the form and will make your life a lot easier, so that you don't have to fill it out every single time. And then you can just change the date and click submit and then ask again. If it's something, because it asks for a very specific time frame, so if it's something where you wanted to fly and then it poured rain or it was snowing or it was too cold or your drone broke or something, you will be in touch with someone from the Flight Information Center, because they'll send you an email to say you're approved, here's your number, contact this number prior to launch, maybe, if the airport wants that. Or it might just say you're good to go, don't call the tower. If you have a transponder, don't use it. And in that, you could just reply to them and say, hey, the weather crapped out. I'm going to try and do this tomorrow. Is this authorization still valid? And they might just get back and say, yeah, you're good, but this is your new number. A couple more things. I've always so Benjamin asked, do others have problems printing their flight authorization? Mine always cut off on the right side of the sheet. I haven't run into that. but I also haven't printed them because I just save them to my tablet because that's what I take on site with me. But maybe like, I don't know if you can like go to try and print it and then like save as PDF first. Could try it that way. I don't know. Don't have actually I do have a degree in technology. I should probably know that. Company requires me to have an ROC-A before I'm totally certified. Advance with them. Where would one prepare for this? And write the exam near Halifax. So the ROC-A is issued by what used to be called Industry Canada. It's now Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada. Yes. Spectrum Certificates is who you'll get that through. So on their website, if you search for, if you just go to Google and search, it'll probably still show up under Industry Canada too, but it's a professional radio certificate rather than an amateur radio certificate. And you can find the whole list of authorized ROC-Ers who can do that testing for you. There's forget the identifier for the guide for it, but there is a guide so that you would know what you're going to be tested on. It's a pretty straightforward thing. There's 25 multiple choice questions. You need to get a 75%, and you can retest as many times as you need. And they may ask you to do some like mock question or like mock radio transmissions. If you can, try and find someone that's doing them that has a background in drones or has worked with drones, because then they'll understand the context of how you're going to use it and they won't ask you to do like a Mayday call or something like that. But the ROC-As aren't super common anymore. At least getting the certification. The knowledge is required, but getting the certification isn't required because NAV Canada doesn't really want you on the radio. They just want you to understand what is on the radio. So you should be able to listen in and understand what's going on. You can go to liveatc.net if you want to familiarize yourself with radio transmissions. And that would be the spot to do that, to kind of get familiar with it. But they really just want you to understand that if someone says they're downwind for runway 27, that they're on the south side of the runway, and to understand what a downwind is and why an aircraft might report that kind of thing. Thank you all for your time. I have a surprise for you. 1 second. If you're still here, this is Camber the adventure dog. And yes, we did. My husband's a pilot too, so yes, we did name our dog an aviation name. So, all right, that's it. Have a wonderful evening, everybody. We're gonna go for a walk.